Thank you. So I was asked for this workshop to talk about deep learning, I guess, because when there are talks about deep learning, it's very useful to have people coming to the workshop. I was also asked to talk about methodology and data science. And so it turns out that I'm in the computer vision team, and some of our students are doing very applied things, such as object detection using deep learning tools. But then I ended up choosing a topic which is maybe the most theoretical one that I have, and which apparently may not be appropriate for data science and methodology, but it was also for me a good excuse to talk about very practical issues that today we have with deep learning approaches. So that's why I have chosen this. So we'll first review briefly a convolutional neural network. So I don't know how many of you are very familiar with these tools. Can you just give me a hint about, or just a bit familiar with this? So it's about half of the audience. So let's look at behind the scene what is a convolutional neural network doing. So it's actually a system that we may call an artificial intelligence system that is used to classify images. And it's actually not doing something which is that intelligent. It's taking a lot of labeled data, so which are pairs of xi that are images and labels yi. So you have n points where n is very large. And you want to find a prediction function which is able to discriminate between several classes of objects. For example, here with these simplistic examples, being able to discriminate between dogs and cats. And all of this is achieved by setting up an optimization problem where you want to minimize an objective which is made of two terms. The first term here is called empirical risk. It's something that measures how good is your prediction f of xi on the label yi, on the true label yi. So then it turns out that in machine learning, it's not that complicated to find a prediction function that is good on the training data, but what you really want is to be good on some data that you have not seen so far. So for that, it's also useful to have ways to regularize the model. And a way to do that is to define functions that will ensure that your prediction function has some smoothness properties. So all of this is not specific at all to deep learning. It's actually a general concept in machine learning, which is pretty old, which is also, I say in machine learning, but that you also find in signal processing, image processing. More or less all the time where you have data, you need to find a model that explains your data. So what is specific to a multi-layer neural network is that the space of function that you consider is explicitly parameterized. That means that here we consider data point x that are vectors, and your prediction function f of x necessarily performs a sequence of operations that are these linear operations represented by these matrices ak to a1. And all of this is interleaved with nonlinear functions that are pretty simple. For example, the most classical nonlinear function that people use today is simply taking a vector and setting to 0 the negative values. So it's called a rectified linear unit function, or ReLU, if you are using a TensorFlow, Caffe, or whatever framework for deep learning. So all of these linear operations, either you don't put any constraint on them. So in that case, we say we call that a fully connected layer of a neural network. So basically, a layer of a neural network is a pair of a linear operation and a nonlinear function. And but you may also have constraints on these linear operations. For example, in the case of images, very often we say I want to find linear functions that are in fact convolutions. So in that case, they have much less parameters than a general linear function. What you need to define are the parameters or the filters of the convolution. And the filters are typically pretty small. For example, for images, they may be of a size of 3 by 3 pixels. So at the end, if we count the number of parameters that we have to learn, they correspond to the entries of these matrices, or the values of the filters. And it leads to an optimization problem which is pretty large. For example, in typical neural networks today, we have 10 millions or more than 10 million parameters to learn, where the number of images may be also of the order of 10 million. So at the end, we get a huge optimization problem, which is non-convex, which is very difficult to solve. So here is the convolutional network is not something which is really new. It's something which was developed, in fact, in the 80s. So here is a picture from a paper by Lequin from the 90s, which presents convolutional neural networks to classify digits or handwritten characters. So we see that this is a representation of the input image. What that will happen to this image is that it will be filtered by a set of convolution filters. And once you convolve your image with a filter, you can put the output of the convolution as a map, which is here. And since we have many filters, we have several maps. So then you will have this, some nonlinear operations. You can also do lots of different operations. For example, one thing that you can do when you have these maps is to reduce the resolution. So in terms of signal processing, it's just a subsampling. In terms of neural networks, we call that a pooling. It's simply reducing the resolution of the map to have less parameters and maybe a lower resolution map which has maybe more invariance. So so at the end, what are the main features of convolutional neural networks that may explain their success? Well, we can say that there are 4 main keywords. So one of them is that what I call they model the local stationarity of images. So in the sense that if you take a point in this map, it carries information from a local neighborhood in your image. And when you go up in the hierarchy, when you go to the next layers, you have still maps. We call that feature maps. And these points on the maps, they carry information from larger neighborhoods than from the previous layer. So we have this modeling of neighborhoods in the image that's called modeling modeling the local stationarity of images, and you do that at several scales. So we have also multi-scale representation of your image. So far it's something that could be achieved with wavelets, for example. Multi-scale plus local stationarity, it's what a wavelet model will do. They also provide some invariance in the sense that, for example, if you do a large pooling operations, you gain a translation invariance. For example, imagine that you take an image, take your image Lena. For example, if you do, if you know what Lena is, if you do image processing, you know that. And you reduce your resolution by subsampling to a single pixel. So it's a very bad representation that loses lots of information, but which is fully translation invariant. You can translate your image, you will get the same representation. So here we don't reduce to 1 pixel. Typically we reduce the resolution by 2 when we go from a layer to another. And what is interesting with convolutional neural network is that there is this compositional representation of images in the sense that you are going to learn some features at a specific scale, and these features will be compositions of features from the previous scale. And that's what typically make it work, in the sense that the previous generation of a computer vision image representation were not really able to do that in a satisfying way. So for example, here there are weird colors. That's a bit strange, but anyway. It turns out that these convolutional neural networks are doing a very highly nonlinear sequence of filtering operations. So then we can say, well, can we interpret the filters? So it's not completely obvious how to do that, but some people manage to do it in some way to find visual representation of what a filter means. And what we observe is that if we take the first layers of these networks, we typically learn filters that are very often some sort of small wavelets, almost Gabor wavelets, or edge detectors, and also some colored blobs or things that detect color transitions between two opposed colors. But when we go up in a hierarchy, we end up having more and more what we will call semantically meaningful things. For example, we may find almost part of objects when we go up in the hierarchy. And all of this is completely learned in a supervised way, meaning that there is no a priori knowledge that is put on the filters. It's just we learn the filters from the data, and this is what you obtain. So that was actually now it was 5 years ago, and more recently people managed to do more artistic views about what the filters are meaning. So it's a paper here which tries to interpret the filters by generating images that would illustrate what the filter represents. So it's almost some sort of art, but what we see is that also for the first layers we have lots of edges that are represented. Then when we go up in a hierarchy, some filters tend to represent textures, then more and more patterns, and when we go up at the end, almost parts of objects. So that's interesting visualization. It's not clear exactly what it means from a scientific point of view, but still it simply shows that when you go up in the hierarchy, we get more and more complex patterns. So here is the picture to give some context. So some context is that until there was a challenge set up in 2010, which is called ImageNet, which is the first large-scale computer vision challenge, which has 10 million of hand-labeled images, 1,000 of image categories, and all of this was orders of magnitude larger than any other data set that was used before in computer vision. And so what happened is that from 2010 and 2011, we had what were called classical computer vision techniques that were winning this challenge, that were pushed to the maximum performance they could achieve. And in fact, people from Grenoble won this challenge in, I think, in 2011. It was Florent Perronin from Xerox, who is now Naver Labs. Then in 2012, people managed to learn a convolutional neural network, so an old computer vision model, in fact. But it turns out that with more computing power and with all of this data, they won the challenge by a fairly large margin. So it was a model with 8 layers, with 50 billion parameters, and then many people improved the network architectures until a very low error rate, which is here only almost 3%, with networks that have more than 100 layers. So now that was the convolutional neural networks today. So then we can ask, well, if we kind of know how to do supervised learning with lots of data, what is next? What are the current problems? So the current problems are a lack of stability that I'm going to illustrate in the next slide, but there are also other problems about learning when you don't have a huge amount of training data. It's relatively important in practice because if you have a new problem where you don't have necessarily natural images, or if you want to apply your problem to something else than images, you don't necessarily want to have an army of annotators working for you to create your data set to train your model. Or when I say an army of annotators, sometimes it's just that acquiring the data is just very expensive. So you don't want to wait for 1,000 years to have enough data to train your model. So then we want to learn with few labeled data, and so far these techniques are not that successful. Doesn't mean that they work very badly, but if we take the extreme case where we try to train these networks with no supervision, so meaning that there are techniques that train the same kind of architectures but without using labels. So we basically obtain an image representation as a vector after using these techniques. We can ask yourself, is this image representation good or not in terms of discriminating power? So a classical way of doing that is to take this image representation and then add on top of it a simple classifier, a linear model, which can be also seen as adding a layer of neural networks which will use labels, which will be supervised. And if we do that, on the ImageNet challenge, so here these are accuracy scores. This is a review of a few recent methods that are evaluated on the ImageNet. We obtain more or less 30, 35 accuracy on the benchmark. So now the question to ask is, well, how does it compare to other unsupervised image representations? And what we often forget to check is how does it compare to the previous non-deep learning approaches that were used until 2011. Because in 2011, image representation were in fact unsupervised. And the state of the art at that time was called SIFT plus Fisher vector. And that was something that achieved 55% accuracy. So there is still a huge gap, in fact, in terms of unsupervised learning between these deep learning approaches and what we used to do before with techniques that were much more handcrafted. So that means that doesn't mean that we need to throw away deep learning approaches at this point. It means that there is still lots to gain for unsupervised learning. We don't know yet how to do that, how to learn deep networks without supervision. So now the stability problem, it's also something interesting. If we take a state-of-the-art image recognition system that has been trained on ImageNet, there are such systems that are now deployed on cell phones, because after you train your model, you can, at inference time, at the test time, you can have things that are pretty efficient that will run on your cell phone. Here is an experiment taken by these people, made by these people, where they take an image from a data set, they print it on a sheet of paper, and then they take their cell phone and they look at this sheet of paper and try to classify. And here the system will tell us, well, this is a washer with 54% confidence, whatever it means. So it classifies correctly the image. Now there are also people who showed that, in fact, you can also try to find an additive perturbation to your image, which is as small as possible, but which will fool your classifier. And what was observed is that it was very easy to generate tiny variations, artificial tiny variations of your images that at the end will completely break the classification accuracy. For example, if we take this image, which visually looks the same as this one, it's classified by the same classifier as before as a safe with 35% accuracy or as a loudspeaker with 24% accuracy. And that was also obtained, it's actually not a numerical artifact, that was also obtained by printing these perturbed images on a sheet of paper, and then using your cell phone from any point of view, you don't get the right classification. So in practice, it's really a problem because you don't want, for example, we talk a lot about autonomous driving. You don't want people printing a sticker, putting it on your car, and then the car is suddenly recognized as a human or as a or as a bridge or as a road. You really don't want to have that. So we really want to have stable systems, and currently we don't have this. So here is the current issue about deep learning approaches. So we don't know well how to regularize. Today there are heuristics that are used, but we know they are not sufficient. And the main question is how to control variations of prediction functions. Meaning you want f of x to be close to f of x prime when x and x prime are similar. Of course, you don't know exactly. We have to define what it means to be similar between, in terms of distance between x and x prime. And all of this is kind of related to how to regularize the network. So let us quickly look to the past. So past for me is kernel methods. It means why past? It's because these days, if you go to NIPS or ICML, everybody is doing deep learning. But if you went to NIPS and ICML 10 years ago or 15 years ago, everybody was doing kernel methods, more or less. So what is a kernel method? It's actually a same kind of objective function, just to simplify a bit, at least for supervised learning. But what you are going to do is to map your data points X to a Hilbert space and do something very simple in this Hilbert space, which is to learn linear forms. So linear form simply means that if you have two classes of labels, you will send your data to a space of very high or infinite dimension, and there you do something simple. You learn a hyperplane to discriminate your two classes. So here's basically the framework. You send the data to this space H, and there you are going to do something simple. So the main purpose is to send your data in a space where you can do lots of geometrical operations. For example, if you have data that are not vectorial data, you can now send them to a space where you can compute angles, project onto hyperplanes. You can do lots of define barycenters between points. Since you are going to infinite or possibly infinite dimension, you are still able to learn rich models. And what is most important is that using this framework, we know how to regularize. In the sense that there is a simple inequality saying that the prediction f of x, if we compare it to f of x prime, we can upper bound it by the product of two terms. One is something which is the distance between the point x and x prime in this new space. So it's independent of your model. It's simply, in terms of data representation, you have a distance between these 2 points. And here you have the norm of f, which is now a point also in this Hilbert space. And this norm is unrelated to the data. It's a property of your model. So then we kind of, in terms of analysis, we can decouple the data representation on the right part and the norm of the model on the other part. So the other purpose, but I'm going to accelerate a tiny bit here, is if you have Euclidean structure on your data, but you are not satisfied with the metric to compare your points. For example, if you have points in 2D here and you're trying to find separating hyperplanes between two classes, you're obviously unhappy with that. You can map your data to a space of higher dimension and possibly be able to find a hyperplane that will separate the data. So here, what is the relation with deep neural networks? In fact, in one of my work, something we tried to do was to define the deep models using kernel methods. And as an extra product, what we obtain is that some deep networks that are parameterized like that can be in fact written as a linear form in a space of very high dimension, which is relatively complex. So we call this construction convolutional kernel networks. And if I have time, I will give you a very quick idea about what it means and how it is constructed. But what is important is this relation. Now, f of x is a linear form in a Hilbert space, and it also corresponds to some sequence of nonlinear operations. So why do we care? We care because phi of x, which is linked to the data representation, is related to the network architecture, and it's independent of the training data. So we can ask questions such as, is this a stable representation? Other question we may ask, does it lose signal information? Can we recover x from this image representation? And also, f is in fact a predictive model. So question we may ask is, can we control the stability of the model? So we may be able, for example, if we use this inequality, if we want f of x to be stable, it means that you want this to be closed when x and x prime are similar. So that means that if this representation phi of x is stable and this quantity f here is small enough, then you will get stability of the prediction function. So that's kind of a motivation to study these deep networks from a kernel point of view. So what is phi of x? Maybe I will skip to the stability result, since I have only 5 minutes. So basically, just to give you a very quick idea, the way, let's simply still look at this image. The way we built this Hilbert space that will linearize a deep network is by using the same principles as convolutional neural networks, which are to model image neighborhoods. So now we are going to represent an image also as a two-dimensional map, and each point on the map is a point in the Hilbert space that carries information from a local neighborhood in the image. We can achieve some invariance also by reducing the resolution of this map by pooling operations. So it corresponds to taking, for example, take a set of points that live in a Hilbert space, take the barycenter, it gives you another point in the same Hilbert space. So we can in fact build a hierarchy of Hilbert spaces that represent larger and larger image neighborhoods, and what we will gain when going up in the hierarchy is to gain more and more invariance in terms of translation invariance and stability to deformations. So let us now go to the stability results. So in terms of stability, so one of the questions is what does it mean for x and x prime to be similar? And one possible answer to this is to say, well, I will say that x and x prime are close to each other when there is a smooth deformation that goes from x to x prime. So that's the basic stability property that you want in terms of stability to deformations. In mathematics, the natural way of defining a deformation of an image is to consider a class of diffeomorphisms that will simply, for example, take an image, tweak the coordinate, and you get a deformation. So the stability of the representation phi, we used a definition by Mala, which probably was used also by other people, but at least this is the literature we are most familiar with. It says that what we want is that the representation of the deformed image should be close to the representation of the original image in terms of a quantity that depends on a constant, which is the norm of x, and something that is small when the amount of deformation is small. So here there are two terms. One is the amplitude of the diffeomorphisms. It's a quantity that will give us translation invariance if the constant C2 is small. For example, forget about this term, say C1 is equal to 0, and take the class, or just take the class of translations, which are also diffeomorphisms. So translations, the Jacobian of the deformation is 0, simply a translation. And it has some, here what we get is the amount of translation. So we see that the translation invariance, we will get it if C2 is equal to 0. And we will be near a translation invariance if C2 is small. Now that's for translation invariance. If you are interested in a class of diffeomorphisms which is larger, which is deformations, then you need to have quantities that carries the amount of deformation, and that will be the amplitude of the Jacobian of the diffeomorphism. So this term here controls deformation. If C1 is small, you get stability. And if C2 is small here, you get translation invariance. So what we can show is actually that, and this was also something studied by Mala in the context of a representation called the scattering transform, which is based on wavelets. It's some sort of a tool which looks like convolutional neural networks, but it uses wavelets and some specific nonlinear operations. So we could show some more general results for a larger class of convolutional neural networks with the results that look like this, where we have at layer n Ur representation, and we can control the quality of the stability of the representation with some also with the same form as the stability definition of Mala. And so a few things that are interesting is that to get the stability, what it requires is to have small patches, as in recent architectures. We can also, it turns out that we can also recover x from phi of x. So we have also, we don't lose any signal information by using this hierarchical representation. If you are interested to a larger class of transformations, I mean, you can consider also the groups of transformations, for example, rotations. You can encode this sort of invariance if you need it. And also something that may be interesting is that for a given deep network, so if you have a network that can be written like this, that you are able to linearize, then it turns out that the norm of f, remember that it's also a term that is required to be small if you want to get stability, is controlled by a product of norms on the filters that are here, in fact, the spectral norms on the filters. So maybe it gives us some ideas about how to regularize the networks. So that's the main conclusion so far, so which is that stability and generalization are related through the regularization, in the sense that if we take this kernel point of view, the natural way to regularize is to penalize the norm of the model. It's a quantity that appears both to get better generalization in terms of machine learning and to get better stability in terms more of data representation. So there are two types of perspectives. So when I say perspective, it's things that we have done not done yet, but that we are currently interested in. If you take an existing deep network, once you're able to regularize, we have some ideas about new regularization function that will help us controlling this norm that I have presented here. So we have currently ongoing work to work with this sort of quantities to regularize the deep networks, and our goal is to have more stable models and to work with less labeled data. We have also some perspective in terms of designing new deep models. In particular, I have not presented it yet, but at first, this kernel point of view for deep models, we didn't try to analyze the existing models. What we try to do is to develop new models that were based on different principles. So we already have these models that turns out, in terms of prediction accuracy, provides the same quality as the regular deep learning models. But and we are trying to understand how stable they are to these perturbations that try to fool the classifiers. So, and since I have only -1 minute left, I will simply make a quick advertisement for a summer school that we are organizing at INRIA with Naver Labs. So there is a website, so don't hesitate to apply. So we are considering application to the summer school until April 4th. So we are welcoming application from people, both from students, academics, and industry. And we have already lots of speakers, but more of them are on the website.